Savannah, Georgia in 1843 was a city that breathed contradiction. On one hand, it was a place of exquisite beauty, the kind that poets described and painters longed to capture. Grand oak trees draped in Spanish moss-lined cobblestone streets, and the air carried the fragrance of jasmine, drifting lazily through verandas where women in silks and lace sipped tea beneath embroidered parasols. But beneath this calm and cultivated surface, something darker stirred. Savannah was not simply a city of grace, it was a city built upon grief. Every polished stone, every brick laid with precision, was touched by the hands of those who were never meant to be remembered. The enslaved men and women whose suffering sustained the illusion of Southern gentility. This illusion was the South's greatest achievement, not its plantations, not its political ambition, but its ability to cloak brutality in beauty. In the eyes of the world, Savannah symbolized refinement, hospitality, and high culture. Yet those ideals existed only because cruelty had been made invisible, and few figures embodied that paradox more vividly than the woman history would come to call the Lady of Savannah. She was by all outward appearances a model of her class, elegant, educated, and admired. Her name appeared in church records and charity rosters. Her presence commanded the drawing rooms of Savannah's elite. Yet behind the closed doors of her estate, refinement took on a different meaning. She was not a woman merely living within the hypocrisy of her time. She mastered it. Her poise was a weapon, her grace a shield. She understood that power in Savannah didn't belong only to those who owned the most slaves, but to those who best performed virtue while doing so. To understand her is to understand how power in the South functioned not just through violence, but through theater. The plantation world was, in essence, a grand performance. Every gesture of hospitality, every Sunday sermon, every polished word of moral instruction was part of a script, one designed to convince both the oppressor and the oppressed that the order of things was natural, divinely ordained. The Lady of Savannah was fluent in that language. She knew when to smile, when to pray, and when to command. The world saw her as a matron of refinement, but the enslaved who served her saw the truth, a woman whose civility masked an iron heart. It's easy to look back and see her as a monster, but doing so risks missing the deeper truth. She wasn't a monster in the supernatural sense. She was human, shaped by the sickness of her world. Her cruelty was cultivated, not spontaneous, but learned. She grew up in a culture that equated ownership with virtue, discipline with faith, and control with love. To question slavery in her time was not only to defy society, but to destroy one's identity within it. And so she didn't question it, she refined it. She transformed moral blindness into a kind of art form, where evil appeared elegant, and dominance was mistaken for destiny. There's something profoundly unsettling in that, because it tells us that evil rarely presents itself in grotesque form. It often wears perfume, speaks softly, and prays before dinner. The Lady of Savannah understood that. She understood how easily people confuse appearances with truth, how quickly moral comfort can override moral courage, and through her, we glimpse the psychological machinery that allowed an entire society to thrive on oppression while convincing itself it was civilized. Imagine the guests arriving at her mansion. The flicker of candlelight against silk wallpaper, the laughter echoing through the parlor, the music of the pianoforte floating above the din. They saw beauty. But the enslaved hands that poured the wine, that set the tables, that washed the linens, they saw exhaustion, humiliation, and fear. Two worlds existed in one space, separated not by walls but by perception. And perception, in the South, was everything. This is what made Savannah's refinement so dangerous. It wasn't the brutality alone, it was the normalization of it. When violence becomes part of the rhythm of everyday life, when suffering becomes background noise, then morality itself begins to dissolve. The Lady of Savannah didn't just live in that world, she personified it. Her life was the ultimate Southern illusion, that one could be both righteous and ruthless, both pious and predatory. If you strip away the lace and the manners, you're left with something raw and revealing, a portrait of humanity at war with itself. The Lady represents what happens when a society prizes order over justice, when it protects comfort instead of conscience. She reminds us that evil doesn't survive because of its strength, but because of the silence that surrounds it. And in that silence, Savannah thrived. Its people told themselves they were different from the barbarity of the frontier. They were cultured, educated, genteel. But culture without conscience is only a costume. And education without empathy is just another form of blindness. The Lady of Savannah was the perfect product of her world, graceful on the surface, hollow beneath it. Her story is not merely about one woman's moral decay, but about how entire civilizations can build themselves upon denial. Savannah's tragedy was not its wealth or its pride. It was its ability to make horror seem ordinary. The lady's beauty, her charm, her composure. These were the masks history wears when it wants to hide its crimes. So when we speak of her, we're not only recalling a forgotten scandal, we're holding up a mirror to ourselves. Because every age has its Savannahs, its polished facades, its respectable evils, its convenient silences. And every time we allow appearance to outweigh truth or comfort to outweigh justice, we walk her path again. The Lady of Savannah is long dead. Her estate has faded, her scandal buried beneath the soil of polite history. But her lesson remains alive, that civilization without conscience is only a beautiful disguise for cruelty. In the antebellum South, ownership was not simply an economic condition. It was a philosophy, a theology, and a way of seeing the world. It reached beyond the plantation gates and into the moral imagination of those who ruled it. For the Lady of Savannah, the plantation was more than property. It was proof of her worth, her identity, and her control over life itself. To lose it would not have been merely financial ruin, it would have been the unraveling of her sense of purpose. And it was this obsession, this feverish desire to preserve the estate, that birthed the cruelest decision of all, the manipulation of bloodlines to secure her legacy. To understand this act, we must enter the twisted logic of her world. Slavery had already turned human beings into instruments of labor, measured not by soul or spirit, but by strength and fertility. The lady, raised among ledgers and land deeds, came to see even the most intimate parts of human life, love, childbirth, kinship, as transactions within a larger system of possession. To her, everything had value only insofar as it could be owned. It was not enough that her estate thrived in the present. It had to be perpetuated, guaranteed, multiplied through the next generation. When her nieces came of age, they were not seen as daughters to be cherished, but as vessels for her designs. They represented potential, wombs that could preserve what she feared losing. Yet the lady understood that the law of her world placed limits on inheritance. The bloodlines of enslaved people were not recognized as legitimate, yet their bodies could reproduce wealth. And so she blurred the line that civilization claimed to draw between family and property, between kinship and commerce. The enslaved men on her estate were chosen not for affection or connection, but for the same qualities one might select in livestock: strength, endurance, vitality. Her nieces, coerced under the weight of dependence and obedience, were made to bear children who were neither free nor fully kin. The children born of these violations were written into the books not as heirs, but as assets. Each child, half blood and half bondage, became a living contradiction, both a product of her lineage and a reminder of her corruption. What makes this story so haunting is not just its brutality, but its cold logic. The lady convinced herself that she was doing what was necessary, that she was protecting her family's name, her estate, her legacy. In her mind, the ends justified the means. Because the estate represented something greater than morality, it represented continuity, a way of outliving her own mortality. She did not see the act as cruelty, but as stewardship, and therein lies one of the darkest truths of history. Evil rarely sees itself as evil. It calls itself duty, order, or destiny. This twisted reasoning reflects a psychological sickness that extended far beyond one estate. It reveals how deeply the institution of slavery invaded not just the economy, but the human soul. It distorted how people loved, how they raised their children, how they understood themselves. Ownership became a language that replaced empathy. It told the enslavers that people could be both kin and capital, that intimacy could coexist with exploitation, that a human being could be both mother and market. The Lady of Savannah was not unique. She was a symptom of a culture that had lost its ability to distinguish necessity from depravity. We often imagine slavery as chains and whips, fields and labor, but its greatest violence occurred in the realm of thought. It reshaped the moral architecture of the mind. It taught an entire society to measure human worth by utility. When that logic seeped into the household, it corroded even the most sacred relationships. And so, in the lady's estate, bloodlines became property lines, and the womb became an instrument of wealth. The tragedy of those nieces is rarely spoken, but it deserves to be. They were victims of both gender and power, a double captivity. In a world that denied women agency, their submission was expected, even sanctified. Their silence was not complicity, it was survival. They lived in a system that demanded obedience and rewarded compliance with safety. And so, when their aunt commanded, they obeyed. Not out of agreement, but out of fear of isolation and ruin. In that sense, they too were enslaved, not in the fields but in the mind. And then there were the children, the ones history forgot. They grew up on the same soil that their own blood had tilled. Some inherited the lady's pale complexion, others carried the darker hue of their fathers. Yet all bore the weight of a lineage too scandalous to be named. They lived as ghosts of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Their very existence was a testimony to how thoroughly the institution of slavery had devoured the meaning of family. This story exposes the central paradox of Southern civilization, that the same people who preach purity and order built their lives upon a foundation of moral confusion. They could speak of honor while trafficking in shame. They could toast to lineage while selling their own blood. The Lady of Savannah's actions were extreme, but they were not alien. They were the logical extension of a world where ownership was the highest virtue. And yet history has a cruel way of sanitizing itself. The estate survived. Its wealth was passed down, its stories reshaped into legends of Southern grace. The truth, the bodies, the children, the moral decay, was buried under a century of silence. Savannah's charm endured, its architecture admired, its ghosts politely ignored. But every time we walk its streets, every time we admire the beauty of its antebellum homes, we walk through the residue of those choices. The lady's story forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about human nature, that when power and fear converge, morality can be rewritten. She believed she was preserving her world, but in truth she was destroying its soul. And so we must ask ourselves, when we defend what we call tradition, whose suffering is hidden beneath it, when we cling to our illusions of innocence, what injustices are we protecting? Power is a strange thing. It begins as a tool, a way to survive, to build, to organize the world, but left unchecked, it begins to consume the one who wields it. The Lady of Savannah understood this, though not in theory, but in instinct. Her life, her choices, and her legacy were shaped by a single intoxicating truth, that to command others is to feel godlike, to stand above consequence, to bend the wills of others until their silence becomes your comfort. In her we see the full psychology of power, not as a historical abstraction, but as a living sickness that corrodes the mind from within. The lady was not born cruel. Cruelty in her world was taught the way language is taught, through repetition, through imitation, through inheritance. From the moment she was old enough to observe her surroundings, she saw domination framed as order, submission dressed as loyalty, and exploitation masked as grace. In that world, to command was to exist. To question that command was to invite ruin. The plantation culture did not just produce slaves, it produced masters, minds trained to believe that control was a virtue, that empathy was weakness, and that hierarchy was divine law. What began as an environment of privilege gradually became a psychological cage. For the lady, power was not simply something she had, it was something she was. It defined her sense of purpose, her identity, even her sanity. Every decision, every interaction, was filtered through the need to assert it. And like all addictions, it demanded more with each passing year. When kindness began to feel like loss, she learned to suppress it. When empathy threatened to disturb her order, she silenced it. When guilt stirred, she buried it beneath ceremony, charity, prayer, social reputation. Each act of dominance required another layer of justification, another moral disguise. That's how power metastasizes, not through open brutality alone, but through quiet self-deception. The lady did not think of herself as cruel. she thought of herself as necessary. She told herself she was maintaining stability, preserving the natural balance, fulfilling her duty to family and faith. In this way, power became its own religion, complete with rituals, hierarchies, and sacred texts that explained why some must suffer for others to live comfortably. Psychologists today might call it cognitive dissonance, but it was far deeper than that. It was moral anesthesia. Power had dulled her ability to feel the humanity of others. Every scream, every tear, every moment of pleading became background noise, the hum of a machine that kept her world turning. And yet, beneath that numbness, there must have been a faint echo, a flicker of conscience that she worked tirelessly to extinguish. Because no matter how powerful one becomes, the soul never forgets what it's crushing to stay that way. The more the lady ruled, the more she feared losing control. That fear was her constant companion, whispering that without power she was nothing. And so, she tightened her grasp, on her estate, her nieces, her enslaved laborers, and even on her own image. She micromanaged not only her household, but the emotions of those within it. Love, joy, rebellion, all were threats. The human spirit itself was a danger she needed to contain. In trying to rule everything around her, she became enslaved by the very power she believed made her free. What's chilling is how ordinary this dynamic is, not only in her time but in ours. Power, wherever it exists, in politics, in business, in households, follows the same psychological arc. It begins with control over others, but ends with the loss of control over oneself. The lady's tragedy lies in how power rewired her sense of morality. She could stand in church reciting hymns about mercy while orchestrating acts of quiet terror at home. And she saw no contradiction, because the human mind is skilled at rearranging truth until it feels comfortable again. This is how cruelty becomes inherited, not through blood alone, but through behavior, through silence, through the normalization of wrong. The children who grew up on that estate, her nieces, her servants, the enslaved, all absorbed pieces of that hierarchy. Some resisted it, others replicated it. And in that cycle, the disease of domination passed from one generation to the next, like a curse that no one dared to name. The lady's story reveals a haunting truth about human nature. When a society rewards control, it punishes compassion. And over time, people learn to suppress the parts of themselves that ache to do good, simply to survive within the system they inhabit. She was not exceptional in that regard. She was simply efficient. Efficient at burying guilt, efficient at disguising harm, efficient at turning love into leverage. But beneath every efficient cruelty lies a quiet terror. The fear of what might happen if the oppressed ever stopped accepting their roles. That fear haunted her. It shaped her every action, every precaution. She would not have named it as fear, of course. She would have called it discipline, vigilance, or prudence. Yet it was fear all the same. The fear that her carefully constructed world might one day expose her own weakness. And that is the psychological core of every oppressor, the awareness, however faint, that their power depends on the silence of others. It is a fragile dominance, one that must constantly be defended, because it is never truly earned. So when we speak of the Lady of Savannah, we are not just recounting the cruelty of one woman. We are studying the anatomy of power itself. How it grows, how it blinds, how it justifies, and how it ultimately devours the person who wields it. Her story is a mirror reflecting not only the darkness of her time, but the recurring human temptation to confuse control with strength. The lady believed she ruled others. In truth, she was ruled by the fear of losing her throne. Power did not elevate her. It consumed her humanity, one rationalization at a time. In every great tragedy of human history, silence plays a role as destructive as cruelty itself. And in the world of Savannah's plantations, silence was not just absence, it was survival. Women in that society were trained from childhood to embody restraint, obedience, and grace. They were taught that their virtue was measured not by what they said, but by what they endured. The Lady of Savannah, her nieces, and countless women of their time lived within a theater of expectations. A world that worshipped the appearance of purity while hiding its corruption behind closed doors. To understand this story fully, we must see how gender became both a weapon and a wound in the antebellum South. The lady herself was a woman navigating a patriarchal order that did not truly allow her freedom. She could own land, yes, but only because she had inherited it under exceptional circumstances. She could exercise power, but only within the socially acceptable performance of piety and domestic virtue. She learned early that her authority could not appear masculine. It had to be disguised as moral guardianship, as care, as refinement. She ruled not by breaking the image of Southern womanhood, but by mastering it. And that mastery came at a cost. Every smile, every curtsy, every polite word was a form of camouflage, a way to conceal ambition in a world that punished women who showed it openly. Her cruelty, then, cannot be separated from her repression. The same society that demanded she act like an angel also taught her that she could only maintain safety and respect by exerting control over others. Power became her form of expression, because love and independence were denied to her. She was trapped in the same moral architecture she enforced, a cage made of manners, not metal. Her nieces lived inside that same structure, but with less authority and fewer illusions. They were young women raised to obey, to serve, to preserve the family's image above all else. Their lives were mapped before they could think for themselves. Marriage, reproduction, reputation. These were the holy trinity of womanhood in Savannah's elite society. Their value was tied to the preservation of the estate, not the expression of their will. And so, when the lady demanded of them the unthinkable, to bear children for the estate, with enslaved men chosen as instruments rather than partners, they found themselves trapped between moral horror and social obedience. We often wonder, why didn't they resist? Why didn't they cry out, refuse, run? But rebellion for women of that time was rarely a visible act. Their power, when it existed, had to be subtle, expressed through silence, through coded gestures, through endurance. They had been raised to equate defiance with disgrace, and disgrace with death, not literal death, but social extinction. In a culture where reputation was everything, to defy family was to become invisible. So they complied, not because they were weak, but because society had stripped them of every safe way to say no. And here lies one of the cruelest paradoxes of the Old South. The same system that enslaved African bodies also imprisoned white women's minds. It divided them by privilege but united them in subjugation. The lady's nieces were victims of a gentler, more invisible kind of bondage, one enforced not with chains, but with tradition. They were bound by expectation, by dependency, by the fear that their survival depended on their silence. Their tragedy was not that they didn't see what was wrong, but that they had been taught they had no right to stop it. In the drawing rooms of Savannah, women whispered their pain behind lace fans and folded letters. They spoke in half-truths and coded words, hinting at scandals that could never be named aloud. But those whispers changed nothing, because polite society turned its head away from the truth. The parlor became the stage where guilt was suppressed and suffering was aestheticized. Pain was only permissible when it was poetic, never when it was political. And yet, history shows us that these same women, often powerless in public, were the keepers of memory. The lady's nieces carried that shame forward, passing it down not in words, but in the quiet gestures of discomfort and avoidance. They taught their daughters to be proper, to be silent, to be good. And so, the moral infection spread across generations, not by act but by repression. The past, when unspoken, does not die. It lingers in the body, in the posture, in the nervous silence that fills a room when certain topics arise. We tend to imagine the plantation system as one of male tyranny, overseers, masters, laws written by men. But women sustained it too, often unwillingly. Their compliance gave it shape. Their silence gave it longevity. When the lady trained her nieces to obey, she was perpetuating the very structure that once confined her. It is the most devastating cycle of all, the oppressed becoming the enforcers of oppression, believing they are protecting themselves, when in truth they are preserving the system that destroys them. In that sense, the parlor and the plantation were not separate worlds. One was the reflection of the other. The cruelty outside was mirrored by the emotional restraint inside. The fields echoed with pain, while the drawing rooms shimmered with denial. Together, they created a moral ecosystem where everyone suffered, but in different ways and in different silences. It is tempting to pity the nieces, and we should. But pity alone is not enough. Their story challenges us to see how oppression often hides beneath respectability, how entire cultures can normalize harm through politeness and ritual. The lady's household was a microcosm of that truth, where grace covered abuse and silence masqueraded as virtue. If history teaches us anything through their suffering, it's that silence is never neutral. It always takes sides. It either shields the guilty or gives voice to the voiceless. The women of Savannah's high society believed that silence preserved them, but it only preserved their pain. There is a certain cruelty in the way history forgets children, especially those born from the places where power and shame collide. On the Lady of Savannah's estate, such children existed in a moral limbo, not quite free, not quite family, not quite human in the eyes of the law. They were the living evidence of everything the South wanted to deny, that its wealth, its faith, its honor were all built upon acts of violation. Their lives were the physical embodiment of a truth the lady herself could not afford to acknowledge. And so she hid them, not necessarily from sight, but from meaning. The children of the estate were born into a paradox. Their faces carried traces of both oppressor and oppressed, a mingling of bloodlines that mocked the very idea of racial purity that the Southern order depended upon. The lady would have looked at them and seen not innocence, but threat, a living crack in the farce she had spent her life preserving. Yet she did not destroy them outright. She did something more chilling. She normalized them. She folded them into the estate's functioning, letting them live as servants, field hands, or household attendants, but never as kin. They were visible but not seen, spoken to but not spoken about. This quiet containment of truth was not unique to her. It was the method by which an entire society kept itself intact. The Southern world depended upon forgetting what it knew. And nowhere was that forgetting more profound than in the treatment of mixed-race children, the unacknowledged descendants of both cruelty and proximity. To accept them would mean admitting that slavery had dissolved the sacred boundaries of family and morality. To deny them meant preserving the illusion that those boundaries still existed. The lady, like so many others, chose denial. She let the estate absorb these children as it absorbed so much else, their labor, their lineage, their lives. But we must not mistake denial for ignorance. Deep down, she understood what they were. Every resemblance, every familiar gesture, every flicker of her own blood staring back from a face she refused to name. These were reminders that power could control bodies, but not erase their connections. She had tried to make the human heart an instrument of her estate, but the heart is a rebellious thing. It leaves traces. It leaks truth where it should not. The children's very existence challenged the moral architecture of her world, whispering the same unbearable truth: you cannot enslave what shares your own flesh. For the nieces, this truth was unbearable in another way. They had borne these children under duress, trapped between obedience and horror. They were victims, yet their motherhood made them participants in the system that dehumanized their own offspring. It is difficult to imagine the psychological weight of that, to carry a child knowing that the world will refuse to recognize it as human. Some may have wept in silence, others hardened themselves to survive. Either way, something inside them fractured. That fracture became another unspoken inheritance, passed down not through blood, but through silence and shame. The children grew up watching this tension play out around them. They learned early that their existence was an offense. Their intelligence was seen as insolence, their beauty as danger, their presence as proof of an unspoken crime. Some tried to please, to earn favor, to find some way to belong. Others withdrew, carrying resentment that burned but had nowhere to go. The estate became their universe, a world that raised them and rejected them in the same breath. And yet, from this cruel soil, something profoundly human persisted. Love still found its way through. A mother's secret glance, a shared laugh between siblings who were not supposed to exist, an enslaved father watching from afar. These fragments of connection refused to die, even when everything around them was designed to crush them. It's a reminder that even in the darkest systems, the human instinct to love remains an act of quiet rebellion. But love alone could not save them. The children of the estate became ghosts long before they died, erased from records, unclaimed in wills, excluded from names. Their descendants, if they survived, would carry only fragments of who they were. The lady ensured that their blood remained profitable but invisible. It was the perfect arrangement for a society desperate to maintain its myths. Savannah's elite could attend church on Sundays, praising purity and family, while walking past their own unacknowledged children in the streets. The entire culture rested on that hypocrisy, on pretending that what was seen was not real, and what was real could never be spoken. The psychological cost of that denial was immense. The lady's household was haunted not by ghosts, but by guilt. Every polite conversation, every gathering, every prayer had to suppress the knowledge that their comfort was built on stolen lives. And suppression, over time, becomes distortion. It warps the conscience until evil feels ordinary. It numbs the heart until empathy feels dangerous. The children of the estate were not only victims of slavery, they were victims of that numbness. The kind that allows a mother to look away, a mistress to ignore, a society to forget. And that is perhaps the deepest wound of all, that these children were never given their rightful place in memory. They were written out of history before they could even write their own names. The lady's story, like the story of Savannah itself, became a carefully edited narrative, one that celebrated beauty while burying truth. The plantations became tourist sites, the architecture preserved, the scandal erased. But if you look closely enough, at the portraits, the records, the gaps between names, you can still sense them. The unrecorded, the unnamed, the blood that refused to disappear. Their story is not simply about the past. It is about what happens whenever power decides which lives are worth remembering. Every generation faces that choice in its own way, to remember selectively, or to confront honestly. The lady's descendants, and by extension all of us, inherit that moral test. In the final years of her life, the Lady of Savannah found herself surrounded by the echoes of her own creation. The estate that once symbolized her power and pride had become a mirror she could no longer control. Every path she walked carried the imprint of those she had used, broken, or buried in silence. The air of the place, once fragrant with wealth and the illusion of order, had grown heavy with memory. But memory has a strange way of surviving denial. It lingers in walls, in whispers, in the uneasy stillness between prayers. And for her, that stillness grew unbearable. She had spent decades believing that control was the same as virtue. That dominance, when refined through etiquette and faith, could be mistaken for righteousness. But time, as it often does, stripped away the illusions she had built. The nieces she once ruled had withered into women hollowed by obedience. The children born of those unspoken horrors had grown into a generation marked by quiet rage and confusion. The very system she had devoted her life to preserving had begun to rot from within. The old justifications, divine will, social order, family honor, no longer sounded like truth, only excuses spoken too often to keep guilt at bay. She began to see what she had refused to see before. The enslaved faces that passed her each day were no longer distant. They were familiar, too familiar. In the sharpness of a jawline, the softness of a gaze, the echo of a voice, she began to recognize pieces of her own bloodline. And that recognition was not just haunting, it was corrosive. It dissolved the foundation of her certainty. For the first time, the moral walls she had built could not protect her from the simple, devastating truth. She had created a world that devoured itself. This realization did not come with confession. The lady did not repent publicly. Like so many figures of power, she mistook silence for dignity. But silence has a way of amplifying guilt. It turns inward, gnawing at the edges of the soul. In her final months, she was said to have refused guests, drawn the curtains, and spent hours sitting by her window, overlooking the slave quarters. A rare act for a woman who had spent her life pretending those quarters were simply part of the landscape. Perhaps she was trying to reconcile the past, or perhaps she was simply afraid of being forgotten by the very system she had served. The tragedy of her story, and of the South that mirrored her, is that she was both victim and architect of her own downfall. Her cruelty was born not merely from malice but from conditioning, from a culture that taught her to see control as survival, to see others' suffering as natural, and to see love as weakness. But when cruelty becomes habit, it turns inward. It eats the conscience first, then the identity. The lady became, in essence, enslaved by the same system she enforced, trapped within its moral blindness, unable to imagine a world beyond its hierarchies. And yet, her story is not just about her. It is about the larger machinery that allowed her existence. A society built on contradictions, a faith divorced from compassion, an economy sustained by pain disguised as progress. The lady was not an anomaly, she was a product. A reflection of what happens when an entire civilization decides that comfort is worth more than conscience. When history is told by those who benefit from forgetting. But history, no matter how carefully rewritten, has a way of resurfacing. After her death, the estate passed through hands, its land divided and sold, the records faded, but not completely. The bloodlines she denied did not vanish, they lived on, scattered through generations who would one day ask where they came from, why their skin tone or surname or story didn't fit the official versions. Slowly, the buried truths began to rise. What was once whispered became spoken, what was hidden in shame became part of the historical record. Savannah's lost scandal, like so many others across the South, reemerged as a mirror not only to the past, but to the moral fragility of the present. Because even now, the impulse to forget remains strong. We prefer our histories clean, our heroes uncomplicated, our tragedies distant. But to look away is to participate in the same denial that shaped the lady's world. Every injustice that remains unacknowledged grows in silence until it becomes culture. And culture, once deformed, repeats itself. New forms of ownership, new hierarchies, new justifications for the suffering of others. The plantation is gone, but the mentality that built it lingers in subtler forms, in exploitation masked as opportunity, in prejudice disguised as tradition, in comfort purchased through the suffering of unseen hands. So, what do we do with stories like hers? We tell them, not to condemn a single woman, but to understand the forces that made her possible. We tell them so that we can see the patterns that still shape us, how fear dresses itself as order, how cruelty hides behind faith, how silence becomes complicity. We tell them because to do otherwise would be to let her story repeat under different names. When you strip away the grandeur, the Lady of Savannah's life is not just a historical scandal, it is a moral parable. It reminds us that power without empathy corrodes everything it touches. Family, faith, and even the soul that wields it. Her downfall was not in losing her estate, it was in never realizing that what she owned had already owned her. The real wealth of life, the kind measured in humanity, not inheritance, was something she could never buy, never command, never enslave. And so, as the last chapter of her story closes, we are left with a question rather than an ending. If she had seen the truth sooner, if she had chosen compassion over control, memory over denial, would her legacy have been different? Perhaps. But that choice now belongs to us, because the real test of history is not whether we remember the powerful. It's whether we remember the powerless they tried to erase. And if we choose silence now, then we are no different from the lady staring out her window, watching a world she built crumble under the weight of her own forgetting.